Welcome back to the deep dive. We have a massive stack of documents today, and honestly, looking at the timeline we're about to cover, it feels like we're looking at the origin story of the modern world.
It really is. We are covering AP European History Unit 5.
Oh.
And if you just look at the dates, so 1648 to 1815, it looks like just another chunk of time on a timeline.
Right.
But when you dig into what actually happened between those 2 years, it's arguably the most explosive era in human history.
We're talking about the moment Europe goes from "I think, therefore I am," which is that high-minded Enlightenment philosophy we talked about in our last deep dive, to the guillotine global war and really the invention of modern capitalism.
That is the exact central tension we need to unpack today. How do you get from the polite salons of Paris, discussing liberty and reason over tea, to the reign of terror and heads rolling into baskets?
Yeah, it's a wild pivot.
This is the era where the modern state nationalism and the global economy are essentially forged in fire.
And we have very specific bookends for this story in the sources today.
All right, so we start in 1648. That's the Peace of Westphalia ending the 30 Years' War. That gives us the concept of the sovereign state.
The idea that a country has borders and makes its own rules.
Exactly. And we end in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, which is the desperate attempt to put the world back together after Napoleon basically blew it up.
So to keep us from getting lost in the smoke of all these battlefields, we've got a roadmap for you. We're going to slice this era into 4 distinct parts. First, we follow the money.
Always follow the money.
The explosion of global commerce and the intense rivalry between Britain and France.
Which is absolutely crucial. You cannot understand the wars or the revolutions without understanding the ledger books first.
Right. Then slice 2 is the explosion itself of the French Revolution. We're going to look at why it happened and why it got so incredibly violent.
And then slice 3 is the aftermath. Napoleon and the conservative attempt to put the genie back in the bottle.
And finally, slice my V. I like to call it the emotional hangover. We'll look at the shift to Romanticism, which is really a profound cultural reaction to all that trauma and cold, hard logic.
Let's start with Slice I, the money. Topics 5.2 and 5.3 in the curriculum.
When we look at the sources regarding trade in the 1700s, this isn't just a few merchants swapping spices anymore, is it?
No, the scale is unrecognizable compared to the century prior. I mean, in the 1500s, you had exploration, you had bold captains finding new routes. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, we are seeing the rise of a highly sophisticated worldwide economic network.
It's globalization, basically.
Yes, Europe is integrating with Asia, Africa, and the Americas into a single system. And the way they did business shifted aggressively.
The sources draw a really sharp contrast between the Portuguese model from the previous era and what the Dutch and British started doing.
It's a total shift in mindset. The Portuguese, back in the 1500s, established what historians call a trading post empire. They were the new kids on the block in the Indian Ocean. They set up fortified posts, partnered with local rulers, and essentially skimmed profits off the top of existing trade networks.
So they were trying to integrate it into what was already there.
Right. They were coercive, sure, but they were largely business partners. They didn't try to govern the interior of India or Africa.
But the Dutch and British, they weren't looking for partners.
No. They shifted to a strictly colonial model. This wasn't partnership, this was subjugation. They wanted absolute, total control of the supply chain. And to do that, they invented a new kind of monster, the Joint Stock Company.
The VOC, the Dutch East India Company.
The VOC is just fascinating. It's the world's first transnational corporation. And if you adjust for inflation, it was likely the most valuable company in human history.
Bigger than the tech giants today?
Bigger than Apple, Google, and Amazon combined.
How does a company get that big in the 1600s?
By inventing the modern financial system specifically to fund violence. That's the dark reality of it. The Dutch invented the joint stock model, which is selling shares to private investors to fund these massive high-risk expeditions that a single merchant could never afford.
Right, because if you're one guy and your ship sinks, you're utterly ruined.
Exactly. But if you have 1,000 investors, everyone loses a little bit, but nobody is destroyed.
Democratized risk for the wealthy.
That's a great way to put it. But the VOC wasn't just a shipping company. They had their own army. They had the power to declare war, mint their own money, and execute prisoners. They were essentially a state within a state.
So it's a corporate state.
Effectively, yes. When they went to Indonesia for spices, things like nutmeg and cloves, they didn't just trade. They literally conquered territory to ensure a monopoly. They would depopulate entire islands if the locals tried to trade with anyone else. It was brutal, systematic extraction.
In reading through the sources, the British East India Company essentially replicates this exact model in India.
They do, but with a geopolitical twist. The British capitalized on the decline of the Mughal Empire. As Mughal authority fractured from within, the British East India Company stepped in. They played local princes against each other, they hired private armies of sepoys, and they transitioned from being merchants to being governors.
So by the mid-1700s, a private company was effectively running India, collecting taxes, administering justice.
Yes, and this merging of state power and corporate profit brings us to the rules of the game at the time. Mercantilism.
We hear this term a lot, but let's define it clearly so you know exactly what it means in this context.
Mercantilism is the operating system of this era. It's based on the idea that there is a fixed amount of wealth in the world, mostly measured in gold and silver bullion. If I have more, you inherently have less. It's a zero-sum game.
Which means trade isn't about mutual benefit like we think of it today with free trade. It's about economic warfare.
Precisely. The state intervenes directly to maximize exports and minimize imports. They want to hoard the gold. They want their empires to be completely self-sufficient. This is why you get things like the Navigation Acts in Britain.
I was reading about those in the primary sources. It seems like a direct, deliberate attack on the Dutch.
It was a blockade in the form of a law. The Dutch dominated shipping in the mid-17th century. Britain passed the Navigation Acts to mandate that goods going to Britain or its colonies absolutely had to be on British ships.
Even if the Dutch were cheaper.
Even then, they were willing to pay more for shipping just to deny the Dutch the revenue.
It's petty, but incredibly effective.
Extremely effective. It crippled the Dutch carrying trade over time and massively boosted the British merchant marine.
And speaking of denying revenue and seizing markets, we have to talk about the Asiento. This came out of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1715. It sounds like a boring bureaucratic term, the Asiento. But when you look at what it actually was, it's incredibly dark.
It is arguably the darkest prize in diplomatic history. The War of Spanish Succession ended with this treaty. Britain won. And one of the prizes they demanded and received from Spain was the Asiento.
Which is what, exactly?
The monopoly contract to supply enslaved people to the Spanish colonies in the Americas.
So the British government fought a massive war specifically to become the world's primary human traffickers.
Yes. And this is a crucial insight for understanding the entire unit. That contract integrated the triangular trade directly into British imperial wealth. The capital that fuels the later Industrial Revolution, the money that built the factories in Manchester and Liverpool, was being accumulated right now through this domination of the Atlantic slave trade and colonial goods like sugar and tobacco.
It really reframes the glory of the empire, doesn't it? It wasn't just pluck and superior sailing skill. It was systemic, violent exploitation. And this intense competition for exploitation leads to what the sources call the global duel. Britain versus France.
This is the heavyweight title fight of the 18th century. It plays out in a series of conflicts, but it really peaks with the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763.
Historians sometimes call this the real First World War.
With very good reason. You had fighting in Europe, Prussia taking on Austria, Russia, and France. You had fighting in India, where the British finally kicked the French out.
Yeah.
And you had the North American theater, which Americans know as the French and Indian War.
And the outcome wasn't a draw. It was a total knockout.
Absolute knockout. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 is a massive turning point. Britain gains Canada, Florida, and total dominance in India. France is deeply humiliated. They are stripped of almost all their major colonial assets. Britain emerges as the singular global hegemon with a navy that truly rules the waves.
But, and here's the important, so what connection that sets up our next section, winning on a global scale, is incredibly expensive.
War creates immense debt. Britain has a massive global empire to pay for now, so they start looking for revenue. They start taxing their American colonies.
And we know exactly how that ends,
Yeah.
1776.
Right. But for France, the humiliation is incredibly deep. They want revenge against Britain. So when the Americans revolt, France borrows heavily to help them.
And that debt is the ticking time bomb.
It is the catalyst. That financial crisis in France, driven by the desire to stick it to the British, leads directly to 1789. The French monarchy effectively bankrupted itself to win a proxy war in America, only to have the democratic and republican ideas of that war come back to haunt them at home.
Which brings us perfectly to Slice 2, the French Revolution. Topics 5.4 and 5.5. We've established the money and the debt. Now we have the explosion.
To understand why France explodes, you really have to look at the structure of society. the Ancien regime. It was legally divided into 3 estates, and the math here is just absurd.
Let's break that math down for you.
The first estate is the clergy, about 1% of the population. The second estate is the nobility, about 2%. Together, they own most of the land, they hold all the best jobs in the government and the military, and they pay 0 taxes. 0. They are legally exempt. Then you have the third estate. Everyone else. Peasants, city workers, wealthy merchants, lawyers. 97% of the population.
Yes.
And they bear 100% of the tax burden.
So you have a system where the absolute poorest and the hardest working are subsidizing the lavish lifestyles of the rich.
And the rich aren't just rich, they are legally superior. A noble could beat a peasant, and the law would largely look the other way. But the third estate was changing. You had this rising bourgeoisie merchants and lawyers who were wealthy, reading Enlightenment philosophy and driving the economy.
They were rich, they were highly educated, but they were treated like peasants by the political system. That builds massive resentment.
Add to that resentment a spark, or really 2 sparks. First, the financial crisis we just mentioned. The king is broke, the international banks literally stop lending to him.
And then nature intervenes.
Terrible weather leads to catastrophic harvests in the late 1780s. Bread prices skyrocket. People are literally starving in the streets of Paris.
So King Louis VI calls a meeting, the Estates General, which hasn't met in over 150 years.
It's a sheer desperation move. He needs them to approve new taxes on the nobility, but the moment they meet, the Third Estate realizes the voting system is completely rigged. The clergy and nobility can always outvote them 2-1, even though the Third Estate represents 97% of the people.
So the Third Estate demanded to vote by head, not by order.
The king refuses, so they go rogue. This is one of the most cinematic moments in history, the tennis court oath.
I love this part.
The Third Estate representatives get locked out of their meeting hall. Literally, the physical doors are locked. So they wander around and find a nearby indoor royal tennis court. They stand there, many dripping wet from the rain, and swear a solemn oath not to leave until they have written a new constitution for France. They boldly declare themselves the National Assembly.
Which is basically an act of treason.
Oh, it is undeniable treason, but they get away with it because the streets of Paris wake up. July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille.
Why the Bastille specifically?
It wasn't just a prison, it was an armory. The people desperately needed gunpowder to defend the National Assembly because they heard very real rumors that the king was sending the military to crush them. But symbolically, it represented pure royal tyranny.
Right, political prisoners were kept there.
Exactly. When the sans-culottes, the common working people of Paris, stormed it and began tearing it down brick by literal brick, it showed the king that he had completely lost control of the monopoly on violence.
This kicks off what historians call the moderate phase of the revolution, 1789 to 1791. It feels very hopeful when you read the early documents.
It is deeply hopeful. It's heavily modeled on the American experience and British constitutionalism. They produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's a beautiful philosophical document. It completely breaks down hereditary privilege. It explicitly says men are born and remain free and equal in rights.
The key shift there is from subject to citizen. That's a massive linguistic and psychological shift.
You aren't just the property of the king anymore. You are an active stakeholder in the nation. They also restructure the church with the civil constitution of the clergy, effectively nationalizing it and selling off its lands to pay the national debt.
And they create the Constitution of 1791, which keeps the king, but severely checks his power. It establishes a constitutional monarchy.
If the story had stopped there, we'd be telling a very, very different history, a much more peaceful one. But it didn't stop. It pivoted to the radical phase, 1792 to 1794.
So why? Why did it go from let's have a lovely constitution to let's kill everyone?
Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear is the driver. France was terrified of foreign invasion because the other kings of Europe, specifically Austria and Prussia, were looking at Paris and thinking, we have to crush this democratic virus before it spreads to our own peasants.
They even issued the Brunswick Manifesto.
Yes, threatening to literally burn Paris to the ground if the French king was harmed.
Which didn't scare the French, it just enraged them.
Exactly. And combined with that was the fear of internal betrayal. Paranoia was rampant. The king actually tried to flee the country in disguise, the flight to Varennes, which proved to the people that he wasn't genuinely on board with the revolution.
He was trying to team up with foreign armies. That completely destroyed any lingering trust in the monarchy.
So the pressure cooker explodes. Enter the Jacobins.
The Jacobins were the radical political club led by men like Maximilien Robespierre. They argued that you couldn't half do a revolution.
They abolish the monarchy entirely and declare a republic. They put Louis XVI on trial for treason, and in January 1793, the guillotine drops. The king is dead.
There is absolutely no going back from regicide. You can't unkill a king.
No. Now they are at war with virtually all of Europe. To survive this existential threat, they form the Committee of Public Safety.
It sounds so benign, like a neighborhood watch.
Right, but its actual job is to ruthlessly root out enemies of the revolution.
This is the infamous Reign of Terror.
Robespierre had this deeply chilling philosophy. He wrote that terror is nothing other than justice prompt, severe, and flexible. He fundamentally believed that to create a flawless republic of virtue, you had to kill anyone who wasn't virtuous enough.
If you weren't enthusiastically supporting the revolution, you were a traitor.
Even complaining about the price of bread could get your head chopped off.
They even tried to change time itself, right? The de-Christianization campaign.
They did. They wanted to wipe the slate of history totally clean. They created a brand new calendar. Year 1 wasn't the birth of Christ, it was the birth of the French Republic. They renamed the months after the weather and nature Thermidor Brumaire.
They turned Notre Dame Cathedral into the Temple of Reason.
Yes, trying to replace religion with pure Enlightenment rationality.
But amidst all this domestic terror, there is a military development that truly changes the world. The Levée en masse.
This is crucial to grasp. Before this point in history, wars were fought by relatively small, professional armies, expensive soldiers fighting for a king's territory. The Levée en masse invented total war, mass conscription.
The entire nation was mobilized for the war effort.
Yes. Young men fought married men, forged weapons, women made tents and served in hospitals.
So it's no longer the army of the king, it's the army of the people.
And that army is fighting for an ideology. That makes them incredibly highly motivated and highly dangerous. They actually start winning. They push back the professional armies of the Austrians and Prussians.
Now we have to zoom out for a second because this loud slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity had a global echo, but it hit a massive hypocritical snag when it crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean.
This is the paradox of liberty. Did the universal rights of man actually apply to people of color in the colonies? Specifically in Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti.
Saint-Domingue was France's ATM at the time. Sugar coffee, it was the most profitable colony on Earth.
But it was built on the most brutal industrial slave system on Earth. The death rate was so horrific they had to constantly import new enslaved people from Africa just to keep the plantations running. When the rumors of the French Revolution reached the enslaved population, they took those Enlightenment ideals very seriously.
Enter Toussaint Louverture.
A former slave who becomes a genius military tactician. He leads a massive slave revolt, and the brilliance is he uses the French revolutionary rhetoric against the French. He writes letters essentially saying, "We are fighting for the very liberty and equality you promised in your declaration."
And amazingly, it works.
It works. Despite Napoleon later sending a massive professional army to try to re-enslave them, an army that got absolutely decimated by yellow fever and Toussaint's guerrilla tactics, they succeed. Haiti formally becomes the first black-led republic in 1804. It remains the only successful slave revolt in human history that resulted in the founding of a state.
It's such a powerful counter-narrative to the European events. Back in Europe, though, the revolution was deeply polarizing intellectuals. We have sources from two very different thinkers on this.
Right. You have Edmund Burke in England, who is essentially the father of modern conservatism. He writes Reflections on the Revolution in France very early on in 1790.
Before the terror even really started.
Exactly, and he predicts the chaos. He says you can't just tear down centuries of tradition and start from scratch based on an abstract theory. Society is a fragile, complex organism. If you abruptly rip it apart, it will inevitably lead to blood and eventually a military dictatorship.
And he was entirely right.
He was hauntingly precise. And then on the other extreme, you have Joseph de Maistre. He's an ultra-conservative.
He takes a much darker view.
He thinks the revolution is literal divine punishment from God for ignoring the king and the church. He argues that humans are inherently wicked, and the only thing that holds society together isn't the reason, it's the executioner.
So the revolution leaves Europe completely intellectually and politically polarized. And out of this chaos, the terror, the extremely weak directory governments that followed, walks a short artillery officer from Corsica,
Napoleon Bonaparte?
which launches us into Slice III, Napoleon's Rise, Dominance, and Defeat, topics 5.6 and 5.7.
Napoleon is fascinating because he serves as this historical Rorschach test for the revolution. You have to ask, is he the child of the revolution or is he its ultimate betrayer?
Let's look at the evidence from both sides. He rises through the military strictly through meritocracy, right? A minor noble like him wouldn't have risen that fast in the old royal army.
Exactly. The revolution cleared the path for raw talent by executing or exiling the old aristocratic officer class. Napoleon stages a military coup in 1799, ends the chaos of the Directory, and establishes himself as first consul. But he eventually crowns himself emperor in 1804.
That specific moment, crowning himself, is so highly symbolic.
It changes everything. In the past, the Pope would crown the emperor to show that power came from God. Napoleon physically took the crown from the Pope's hands and put it on his own head. He was broadcasting, "I answer to no one. I earned this. I am the state."
But let's look at what he did domestically, the Napoleonic Code.
This is undoubtedly his most enduring legacy. He standardized the laws across France. He preserved the core revolutionary principle of equality before the law for all male citizens. He abolished feudalism wherever his armies went.
So if you were a peasant in Germany and Napoleon's army showed up, he was liberating you from your landlord and the restrictive local guilds.
That sounds exactly like the child of the revolution.
Right. But then there's the other side of the ledger. There was zero political liberty.
None. No freedom of speech. No free press. He had a ruthless secret police led by a man named Fouché that opened citizens' mail and spied on everyone.
And he made peace with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801.
But only to use religion as a cynical tool of social control. He famously said, "Religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet." And for women, the Napoleonic Code was a total disaster.
Break that down for us because it's a major point in the sources.
The early revolution had actually made some progressive strides for women legalizing divorce, for example. Napoleon rolled all of that back. The code made women legal dependents on their fathers and then their husbands. They couldn't independently own property. They couldn't sign legal contracts without a man's permission.
I think he famously said women are nothing but machines for producing children.
He did. So to summarize his domestic policy, you have equality for men, total submission for women, and an incredibly efficient authoritarian dictatorship for everyone.
And he uses that efficiency to conquer most of Europe. He builds this grand empire. He redraws the map entirely. He puts his own brothers and sisters on thrones in places like Spain and Italy.
But there is one island he absolutely cannot conquer: Britain.
Because the British Navy is just too strong.
Especially after Admiral Nelson completely destroys the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Napoleon realizes he cannot physically cross the English Channel, so he pivots to economic warfare, the continental system.
This was the strategy that if he couldn't physically invade Britain, he would financially starve them.
Right. He forbade the entire continent of Europe from trading with Britain. He thought Britain was just a fragile nation of shopkeepers and would economically collapse without European customers.
But it massively backfired.
Spectacularly, Britain had global markets. They had the Americas. They had India. They didn't actually need Europe as much as Europe desperately needed British manufactured goods. Smuggling became rampant. The continental system really just made everyone in Europe incredibly angry at Napoleon because it couldn't get basics like coffee sugar or cheap textiles.
And that widespread anger sparks something entirely new across the continent: nationalism.
This is a tremendous historical irony. Napoleon spread the Enlightenment idea of nationalism, that people should rule themselves as a sovereign nation, but then he ruled those same people as a foreign tyrant.
We see this explode in Spain.
The Spanish ulcer, as he called it. Napoleon brutally deposes the Spanish king and puts his brother Joseph on the throne. The fiercely Catholic Spanish people rise up, but they don't fight a traditional pitched battle, they fight a guerrilla war.
Which translates to little war.
Exactly. Ambushes, hit-and-runs, assassinations. It forced Napoleon to keep hundreds of thousands of troops tied down in Spain, bleeding his military resources dry.
And we see nationalism brewing in Germany, too.
Yes. German intellectuals started looking at the oppressive French occupation and asking, why are we being ruled by them? We share a language, we have a German soul, a Volksgeist. Napoleon inadvertently forged modern German nationalism by giving the divided German states a massive common enemy.
And then comes the big mistake, 1812, the invasion of Russia.
The classic historical blunder: never invade Russia in the winter. But he didn't start in winter. Napoleon gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, roughly 600,000 men. He marches in expecting a quick, decisive battle.
And the Russians just refuse to fight him? They just leave?
They systematically retreat, scorched earth tactics. They burn their own crops, they poison their own wells, they destroy their own bridges. They even burn their own capital, Moscow, to the ground rather than let Napoleon have it. Napoleon marches his massive army into a smoking wasteland.
He sits in the ashes of Moscow, waiting for a treaty that the Tsar never sends.
So eventually he has to retreat in the dead of the Russian winter, and that retreat is pure horror. Freezing temperatures, starvation, typhus, constant raids by Cossack cavalry. He entered Russia with 600,000 men. He came back with maybe 40,000 effective soldiers. The grand myth of French invincibility was completely shattered.
This directly leads to his abdication. Then a brief wild return, known as the 100 Days, and then his final decisive defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Which brings us to the conservative cleanup crew, the Congress of Vienna.
1815. The leaders of the victorious powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, meet to put the shattered pieces of Europe back together. The primary architect of this peace is Clemens von Metternich of Austria.
I feel like Metternich gets a pretty bad rap in history, but from his perspective, he's just trying to stop the bleeding of a quarter century of war.
He is the ultimate fireman of Europe. You have to understand his mindset. He had witnessed the chaos of the revolution firsthand. He genuinely believed that liberal democracy inevitably led to the terror of the guillotine and the tyranny of a Napoleon. His singular goal was reestablishing the conservative order.
So what were the actual decisions they made at Vienna?
They built the peace on three main pillars. First is legitimacy. They deliberately put the legitimate hereditary kings back on their thrones. The Bourbon dynasty is restored in France.
Like the last 25 years never even happened.
Exactly. Second is containment. They redrew the map to physically surround France with stronger states. They gave Prussia large tracts of land on the Rhine River. They created a bigger kingdom of the Netherlands. They wanted a buffer zone so France couldn't just march out again.
And the third pillar?
The balance of power and the creation of the concert of Europe. They set up a conservative system where the great powers would meet periodically to solve disputes diplomatically and, crucially, to team up to violently crush any future liberal or nationalist revolutions.
It's basically an early 19th century version of the UN, but exclusively for protecting kings.
And for suppressing civil rights.
Yeah.
But to be objectively fair to Metternich, his system actually worked. It prevented a major continent-wide conflict for almost exactly a century until World War I broke out in 1914.
So they managed to put the heavy lid back on the boiling pot. But the heat underneath is still on. You really can't unring the bell of the French Revolution.
No, you can't. The powerful ideas of liberalism wanting constitutions and rights and nationalism wanting your own country are forced underground now into secret societies and student groups, but they are steadily growing.
Which transitions us perfectly to our final slice today. Slice 4, the reaction. Because all this hyperlogic and mass war and the guillotine, it did something profound to the human psyche. We enter the cultural era of Romanticism. Topic 5.8.
This is a massive vibe shift, a total cultural pivot. Think about it. The Enlightenment was all about pure reason, cold mirrors, clear glass, strict categorization. Romanticism is a visceral scream against that. It's fundamentally about emotion.
It feels a bit like a dramatic teenage rebellion against their strict, highly logical parents.
That's a remarkably accurate analogy. The Romantics looked at the emerging Industrial Revolution, the dark smoke, the deafening factories, the turning of human beings into interchangeable cog, and they said this is utterly soulless. They looked at the Enlightenment logic that mathematically justified the reign of terror and said this is cold and inhuman.
So what do they actually value instead?
The primary concept is the sublime. This is the idea of nature that is terrifying, awe-inspiring, and untamable. Not a perfectly manicured French garden, but a violent thunderstorm, a jagged mountain peak, a ship being torn apart at sea. They wanted to feel incredibly small in the face of the infinite.
And they had this deep nostalgia for the past, right?
Well, specifically the Middle Ages. The Enlightenment thinkers hated the Middle Ages. They dismissively called them the Dark Ages. The Romantics loved them. They romanticized knights and deep faith and mystery and magic.
Let's look at a concrete example from the sources, the Grimm brothers. We all know their fairy tales.
But consider why they actually collected them. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm were early German nationalists. They traveled around the German countryside, meticulously collecting these oral folk stories, not to entertain children, but to academically prove that there was a distinct unifying German spirit that existed within the common peasants.
So literature actively becomes a political tool for building nationalism.
Exactly. It's constructing the emotional identity of the nation from the bottom up rather than the top down.
What about visual art? The source mentions the painter Caspar David Friedrich.
His painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, you've almost certainly seen this image. A man standing on a rocky precipice, his back turned to the viewer, looking out over swirling mist and jagged mountain peaks. It's the ultimate visual representation of Romanticism. It's entirely about the solitary individual confronting the vast unknown. It's deeply moody and introspective.
And music. We see this transition clearly with Beethoven.
Beethoven is the perfect bridge figure. He starts his career in the classical style, very structured, mathematical, polite, like Mozart. But by the time he hits his later symphonies, specifically the Eroica, he is deliberately breaking all the established rules.
Didn't he originally dedicate the Eroica to Napoleon?
He did. He thought Napoleon was a Republican hero. But when Napoleon declared himself Emperor, Beethoven was so furious he violently tore up the title page. And music itself reflects that passion. It is violent, loud, chaotic, emotional. It reaches out and grabs you by the throat.
Even religion got a romantic reboot in this era. Methodism.
John Wesley in England. The Enlightenment had made religion very dry and intellectual. Deism was popular, the idea of a clockmaker god who built the universe, wound it up, and completely walked away. Wesley preached what he called a heart strangely warmed.
So it's about a deeply personal, highly emotional connection with God, rather than dry theological ritual.
Yes. So Romanticism isn't just writing nice love poems, it's a total holistic rejection of the machine view of the universe.
And it provides the raw emotional fuel for the political revolutions that are going to explode in the 19th century. Because you can't easily get people to die in the streets for tax code, but you can absolutely get them to die for the nation or for the spirit of the people. Romanticism essentially weaponized that feeling.
Exactly right.
Okay, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. From the Dutch spice trade and the horrific slave ships, to the storming of the Bastille, from Napoleon's legal code to Metternich's conservative drawing room, and finally to the moody nationalist poets of Romanticism. Let's synthesize this for the listener. What is the true big-picture takeaway for Unit 5?
If you zoom all the way out, Unit 5 is really the painful birth trauma of the modern world. Economically, Britain decisively wins the global duel. They defeat the Dutch, they humiliate the French, and they aggressively accumulate the massive colonial capital that directly sparks the Industrial Revolution.
And politically.
Politically, the ancient divine right of kings is mortally wounded. Metternich desperately puts a conservative bandage on it in 1815 at Vienna, but the internal wound is fatal. The radical Enlightenment idea that sovereignty truly comes from the people, that is permanently out there now.
And warfare. Warfare changed completely.
It shifted from being a limited territorial sport of kings to a total ideological clash of nations. Mass mobilization, the levée en masse means war, is now an existential struggle involving the entire civilian population.
I'm looking forward as we close out.
We're perfectly setting up the 19th century. It's going to be a massive geopolitical wrestling match between the conservative order established at Vienna, the guys trying to rigidly keep the lid on, and the explosive forces of liberalism and nationalism that the French Revolution unleashed. That underlying tension is going to define absolutely everything until the whole global system blows up again in 1914.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to chew on. We talked about the Congress of Vienna desperately trying to freeze time in 1815.
They certainly tried. They forcefully moved borders. They proudly restored hereditary kings.
But the Congress of Vienna completely ignored the one terrifying thing the revolution had truly unleashed, the idea that the nation isn't the king, it's the people. And that idea doesn't just sit quietly in the dark. It is about to violently burn down the rest of the century.
It certainly is.
A powerful place to stop. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into blood debt and the birth of modern era.
Keep analyzing the history.
And keep questioning the sources. See you next time.